The day Eleanor Hartwell walked into the middle of Main Street and told half the town exactly where they could put their opinions was the day most people assumed she had finally lost her mind. She was 28 years old, 6 feet tall in her work boots, and she had just overheard 3 men outside the feed store taking bets on how long it would take before she died alone. What nobody expected, not the gamblers, not the gossips, not even Eleanor herself, was that a stranger had been standing close enough to hear every word. And he was smiling. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. This one's worth it. The town had a way of eating people alive without ever drawing blood. Dry Creek sat in a crease of the Texas hill country like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. A collection of wood-planked buildings, sun-cracked dirt roads, and opinions as hard and immovable as the limestone bluffs to the north. It wasn't a cruel place exactly. It was just small. And small places have long memories and short patience for anything that doesn't fit neatly into the story they've already decided to tell about themselves. Eleanor Hartwell had never fit. Not once. Not even as a child. She had been tall since she was 11. Taller than the boys her age. Taller than most of the men by the time she turned 16. Taller than her own father by the time she buried him at 23. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's square jaw, and a mind that moved faster than most people in Dry Creek were comfortable with. She could do figures in her head before the other shopkeepers had located their ledger books. She could read a contract and find the flaw on the second pass. She had strong hands from years of lifting crates and moving inventory, and she had a voice that carried in an open space, clear and unhurried and certain. None of that was considered an asset for a woman in 1877. Eleanor knew this. She had known it for so long that the knowledge had calcified somewhere behind her sternum, not a wound anymore, just a permanent feature of her architecture, like the scar on her left palm from a broken jar at age 9. It was simply part of her, something she carried without thinking about it until some moment, usually unexpected, pressed directly on it. The Hartwell Supply Company occupied the widest storefront on the east side of Main Street, wedged between the post office and Garvey's Hardware. Eleanor's father, Thomas Hartwell, had built it up from a single wagon and a handshake deal with a regional distributor out of San Antonio. By the time Eleanor took over, first in practice, then in full legal title after his death, the store supplied roughly half the ranches within a 30-mile radius, with everything from rope and lamp oil to flour, salt pork, and the occasional luxury item Thomas had taken to stocking on a hunch. His hunches had usually been right. Eleanor's were better. She had expanded the dry goods section in her second year. She had negotiated a faster delivery schedule with the distribution company, shaving 4 days off the average restocking cycle. She had extended credit to 3 ranching families during a hard winter when the alternative was watching them fold, and all 3 had paid back in full before summer. She ran the store with the kind of quiet precision that didn't announce itself. It just worked, consistently, season after season. Dry Creek noticed. Dry Creek also never quite forgave her for it. "It's not natural," she had overheard Agnes Pell saying once, in the mercantile on the other side of town, not troubling herself to lower her voice. Agnes was 60-something and had buried 2 husbands and considered herself an authority on the correct way to be a woman. A woman running a business that size on her own without a man to, well, to manage things. It's not the natural order. Eleanor had been standing 3 feet away, examining a bolt of calico fabric she didn't need. She had set it down carefully, turned around, and walked out without buying anything. She hadn't gone back. The thing was, Agnes Pell wasn't alone. She was just the loudest version of a widespread opinion. Most of Dry Creek held some variation of it, even people who were otherwise decent, who greeted Eleanor politely on the street and brought her their business and paid their accounts on time. Somewhere underneath the surface transaction, most of them shared a low-grade discomfort with her, like she was a question they didn't know how to answer. The men were the most specific about it. "Too sharp," she had heard one say. Frank Decker, who ran the livery stable, a man she had never done anything to. "Man doesn't want to feel like he's being assessed every time he opens his mouth." "Too tall," said another, Bill Kramer, who sold saddle leather and squinted at her whenever she walked past. "Makes a man feel small. No offense." No offense. The 2 most useless words in the English language as far as Eleanor was concerned, because they were always attached to something offensive. Too much was the most common version. She heard it in various forms, with various faces attached to it, across various years. Too much of everything, stacked up into one woman who didn't have the decency to apologize for it. Eleanor pretended this didn't touch her. She had gotten very good at the pretense. She kept her expression even, her voice level, her spine straight. She went home at the end of the day, fixed herself a plain supper, sat at the table in the kitchen her mother had painted yellow in some other, softer era, and told herself it didn't matter. Some nights she believed it. Other nights she sat with her coffee going cold and listened to the wind work its way under the back door, and she let herself feel the truth of it for a minute or two. The truth being, it did matter, not because she wanted their approval. She had stopped wanting that a long time ago, but because underneath all of it was a question she couldn't fully suppress. What if they're right? Not about the store, not about her capability, about the rest of it. The part that lived in the space between competence and loneliness, in the long, quiet evenings, and the unshared meals, and the half-second each morning when she woke up and reached some instinct toward another warmth that wasn't there. What if there really was something about her that made her not unlovable, exactly, just impossible to sustain? What if she was the kind of person who made sense in small doses but wore people out over time? What if the problem wasn't the town's small imagination, but something actual and true about who she was? She never let herself stay in that question for very long. Long enough to feel it, then she put it away, like a letter you weren't ready to read yet, filed somewhere you wouldn't stumble on it by accident. She had survived 36 years, 28 of them in Dry Creek, 8 of those running the store alone. And she intended to keep surviving. That was enough. It had to be. Set. The morning that changed things started like most mornings. Eleanor was up before 6, dressed and downstairs by 7:30, had the stove going and coffee made by 6:45. She unlocked the front of the store at 7 sharp. She had always been precise about the hours, on principle, and began going through the morning's tasks before her assistant, a 15-year-old boy named Caleb Moss, arrived at 7:30. Caleb was a good kid, scrawny, serious, with an earnest quality that Eleanor found quietly endearing. He swept the floors without being asked twice, kept the shelves faced neatly, and had recently begun to show a genuine aptitude for inventory. He could spot a discrepancy in the count before she pointed it out, which she considered a genuine gift. She paid him a fair wage and had told his mother directly, because the mother had worried about it, that Caleb was an asset and she intended to keep him on. The morning's first task was reconciling last week's accounts with the delivery manifest from Wednesday's wagon. There was a discrepancy in the bean order. 12 sacks recorded delivered against 14 sacks billed, and Eleanor wanted it resolved before she paid the invoice. She settled at the counter with her ledger and her coffee and worked through it with the concentrated, quiet pleasure she always took in this kind of problem. Numbers had the virtue of being honest. They were either right or wrong. There was no ambiguity, no social subtext, no managing anyone's feelings about them. They just were. She found the error by 7:15. The delivery man had recorded a partial load on 2 separate manifests and double-counted. She made a note, set it aside to address with the distributor, and moved on to the mail that had come in on Tuesday and was still sitting in a stack on the far end of the counter. Most of it was routine. 1 bill, 2 supply catalogs, a notice from the county regarding road maintenance assessments that she'd need to respond to. At the bottom of the stack was a letter from her cousin May in San Antonio, which she set aside for the evening. May wrote long, generous letters full of city gossip and warmth, and Eleanor liked to read them when she had time to appreciate them properly. Caleb arrived at 7:30, said good morning without making eye contact. He was shy in the mornings, and picked up a broom without being directed. Eleanor poured him a cup of coffee, which she had started doing about 2 months in because she noticed he came to work without having eaten and was half dead until 10 o'clock. He had never mentioned it. She had never made a production of it. It was just coffee, set on the counter near where he worked, available if he wanted it. He always wanted it. Delivery on Thursday? He asked, between sweeps. Wednesday this week. Whitmore moved the schedule up for May. I'll pull the space in the back. I already counted. We've got room for everything except the timber order, and that's going directly to the Caldwell Ranch, so it won't come through here anyway. Caleb nodded and kept sweeping. The morning traffic came and went in the usual pattern. Old Pete Jarvis first, because he was always first, a creature of absolute routine who arrived at 8:05, every single Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday for reasons Eleanor had never fully understood and had stopped trying to explain. He bought tobacco and a newspaper and left without much conversation, which was fine. Then Mary Sutherfield and her oldest daughter, in for flour and sugar and a quantity of baking soda that suggested something ambitious happening at the Sutherfield household. Then 2 ranch hands from the Collins operation, in for lamp oil and rope and a spool of wire, who were perfectly polite and quick about it. Then around 9:30 things slowed down for a while, the way they always did mid-morning. Eleanor used the time to write the letter to the distribution company about the bean discrepancy, then started drafting a note to the county office about the road assessments. She was midway through the second page when she heard the door open and a woman's voice say, "Absolutely nothing he could have done different, Martha. I'm telling you." She didn't look up. Multiple people came through the door at once sometimes, and not all of them were there to shop. Dry Creek's social life operated largely in transit. Conversations started on the street and continued wherever people happened to end up. "Well," this was a different voice, lower, with the particular satisfied flatness of a statement about to arrive at its predetermined conclusion. "I heard Ellison had been courting her for nearly 3 months." Eleanor's pen slowed slightly, not because she was listening, but because something in the cadence suggested the conversation was positioning itself near her. 3 months! The first voice again. That was Norma Wells. She recognized it now. Norma ran the boarding house and had an efficient interest in everyone else's business. And then just nothing? Just stopped coming around? Said she made him feel like she was grading him on something. This was Martha Giles, wife of the town's doctor, a woman who was not unkind but who had an unfortunate tendency to repeat things without examining whether they should be repeated. Every time he opened his mouth, she'd look at him like she was calculating something. "Well?" A beat. "You know how she is." The "she" landed with a particular quality, that soft, definitive emphasis that communicated the subject without requiring a name. The kind of "she" that didn't need clarification because everyone already knew. Eleanor kept writing. Her letters formed neatly, one after another. She was very practiced at this. Very practiced at continuing to function while a conversation that was about her proceeded 6 feet away from her, in her own store, in a volume that ensured she could hear it if she had ears at all. "Honestly," Norma continued and lowered her voice by approximately 10%, which still carried clearly in the wood-walled space, "I feel for the men who try. She's a perfectly capable woman. Nobody denies that. But capable and livable are different things. The right man just hasn't, or doesn't exist." Norma, cheerfully definitive. "Some women aren't meant for it, and there's no shame in that. Lord knows she's done well with the store. Some people just aren't built for the softer things." Eleanor finished her sentence, blotted the ink carefully, set down her pen. She looked up. Norma Wells and Martha Giles were standing near the sugar bins, bags in hand, in that particular posture of women engaged in serious social analysis, leaning slightly toward each other, invested and satisfied. Neither of them appeared to have registered that the subject of their commentary was 4 feet away, fully audible, with functional hearing. "Good morning," Eleanor said. Both women startled. Martha had the grace to look uncomfortable. Norma recovered faster. She usually did. "Eleanor, good morning. We were just in for a few things." "I know." Eleanor's voice was even. It was always even. "Anything specific you need? Or are you still browsing?" A brief charged pause. Martha was looking at a point somewhere near Eleanor's left shoulder. "Sugar," Norma said, 2 pounds. "Caleb," Eleanor said without turning around. "Got it," Caleb said from the back, and came forward to the counter with his measured efficiency. Eleanor picked up her pen again and returned to her letter. The remaining transaction was quick and businesslike. Neither Norma nor Martha said anything that wasn't directly related to purchase and payment. When they left, the door swung shut behind them, and the store settled back into its ordinary quiet. From somewhere near the shelving in the back, Caleb cleared his throat. "I could, accidentally, misplace their usual order sometime," he offered. The offer was delivered in the tone of someone proposing something technically unprofessional, but making the availability of the option known regardless. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. It was a real laugh, short and genuine, and it surprised her slightly. Don't, she said. They pay on time. Caleb went back to his shelving. Eleanor returned to her letter. She finished the sentence she'd been on when the women arrived. Read it over. It was fine. Accurate, clear, appropriately firm on the subject of the billing discrepancy without being aggressive about it. She signed it, folded it, addressed the envelope. She was fine. She was perfectly fine. She just needed a minute, the way she always needed a minute after things like that, to let the tightness in her chest redistribute itself back into the familiar architecture of simply the way things are. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something lower grade and less specific than grief. More like weather. The kind of weather you adjusted your coat to every day that you didn't bother naming anymore. She sealed the envelope. She was fine. That by 2 in the afternoon, the sun had gotten serious about itself, pressing down on the street outside in the flat, authoritative way of late spring in Texas. The foot traffic had thinned out in the midday heat. Most sensible people in Dry Creek operated on the same unspoken schedule, active in the morning and late afternoon, inactive through the worst of the afternoon heat, as though the town itself observed a siesta that nobody had formally declared. Eleanor used the quiet hours to work on the back room, which had gotten disorganized over the winter. She was not a person who tolerated disorganization in her professional spaces. She found it inefficient, and inefficiency in a supply business was money walking out the door. So she worked methodically through the stacked crates and barrels, reassessing the organization scheme she'd last updated in November, and adjusting it for the different product mix they carried in spring and summer. It was good work, concrete and physical, and requiring just enough mental attention to keep her occupied without demanding the kind of thought that sometimes ran in unhelpful directions. She was in the process of shifting a heavy sack of feed grain when she heard the bell above the front door. "Be right out," she called. She settled the grain sack into its new position and wiped her hands on her work apron as she came through the back room door into the main store. The man standing at the counter wasn't anyone she recognized. She noticed this first because she recognized almost everyone who came through the door. In a town of Dry Creek size, strangers were easy to clock, and she had a habit of logging faces the way she logged inventory, automatically and without particular effort. She didn't know this face. Mid-30s maybe, with the particular weathered quality that came from years of outdoor work. Not roughness exactly, but a kind of settled durability, like leather that had been properly broken in. He was tall enough that the low ceiling of the store didn't give him much clearance. Brown hair, sun-bleached at the temples. A day or two of stubble. He was wearing working clothes, clean but worn, and he carried himself with the easy practicality of someone who spent more time doing things than thinking about how he appeared to be doing them. He was looking at the shelving on the far wall, scanning the labels with a slight squint, as though trying to locate something specific. He hadn't noticed her come in from the back, or if he hadn't made a thing of it. "Looking for something?" Eleanor said. He turned. His eyes were a medium brown, straightforward, without any of the particular qualities she had learned to recognize. The one men sometimes got when they first registered her height. That fractional recalibration that communicated something without saying anything. He didn't do that. He just looked at her the way you looked at a person who had just spoken to you, which sounds like a simple thing and was, in Eleanor's experience, less common than it should have been. "Lamp oil," he said, "and I was told you might carry a specific kind of rope, treated for fence work, double braided." "I do." She moved to the right side of the store, pulled 2-quart cans of lamp oil from the shelf. She had restocked them that morning, and set them on the counter. "The rope's in the back. How much do you need?" 100 feet to start. Might come back for more depending on how the fence line looks when we get to it." "You're working a ranch nearby?" "Roper's Creek spread, west of town, just took on the foreman position." He said it matter-of-factly, not with the slight overemphasis people sometimes used when they wanted you to know their position mattered. "Name's Mercer, Rhett Mercer." "Eleanor Hartwell." She extended her hand because she always extended her hand. She had decided that sometime around age 20 and had never stopped doing it regardless of whether it made anyone uncomfortable. He shook it without hesitation. His grip was firm and practical, the handshake of someone who had shaken a lot of hands for actual reasons. "Owner?" he asked. "Owner. Good operation," he said, glancing around the store. He wasn't flattering her. There was no particular warmth in his tone, just an honest assessment from someone who appeared to have some experience assessing supply operations. Clean stock, organized. You can tell a lot about a business by how the back sections are kept. The back is actually in the middle of being reorganized, Eleanor said. Come through. She led him through to the back room, which was currently in a state of controlled transition, organized in terms of what was going where, but not yet in its final configuration. She pulled the double-braided fence rope from the third rack, confirmed the footage remaining on the spool, and cut him 100 feet with the clean efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. Rhett Mercer watched the process without commenting on it, without specifically commenting on the fact that she handled the large spool and the rope cutter herself, without asking if he should do it or offering to help with the heavy part, without any of the three responses men usually had to watching her handle physical work. The commentary that it was impressive, the commentary that she should let him help, or the uncomfortable silence of someone who wasn't sure what the etiquette was. He just watched, and when she was finished, he said, "That'll do," and picked up the coiled rope in a way that made it clear he was taking it to the counter and expected her to follow. She followed. "Account or cash?" she asked. "Cash for today. I'll set up an account once I've got the ranch book sorted. Might be a few weeks before I know what the foreman's purchasing authority runs to." "That's fine. Walk-in pricing is the same regardless." She quoted him the total and he paid it without negotiation, which she appreciated. Some men made a practice of haggling with her on principle, not because the prices were wrong, her prices were fair and she knew it, but because the act of not negotiating with a woman somehow felt to them like a loss of some kind she didn't fully understand. He counted out the bills with the same lack of drama he'd applied to everything else, took his oil cans and his rope, and said, "Much obliged, Miss Hartwell." "Hartwell's fine," she said. "Or Eleanor." He paused, barely, and nodded. "Hartwell, then. I'll be back once the account's sorted." "I'll be here," she said. He left. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, not quite sure what had just happened, or rather, what had failed to happen. He had not made any comment about her height. He had not looked at her with the particular look. He had not said anything about the store running well for a woman, or asked her when her husband or brother came in to handle things. He had treated the transaction as a transaction, had treated her as the person running the operation, without seeming to require any particular credit for doing so. It was possible he was new enough to the area that nobody had told him about Eleanor Hartwell yet. People usually found out fairly quickly, in her experience. The opinions of Dry Creek had a way of circulating efficiently. She picked up her pen, found her place in the letter she'd been writing, and returned to work. Well, he came back on Friday, then again the following Tuesday, then Thursday. Each time it was legitimate business, rope, hardware, lamp oil again when the first cans ran low, a particular grade of axle grease that the general hardware didn't carry. The Ropers Creek spread was apparently in the process of significant repair and restocking, which meant steady and varied purchasing requirements, which meant Rhett Mercer had occasion to be in Hartwell supply with some regularity. Eleanor noticed, she noticed everything. This was simply how she operated, that he always came during the mid-morning window, between 9 and 11, when the store was typically quieter. She assumed this was a scheduling coincidence, a function of what time of day the ranch work allowed him to get into town. Later, she would reconsider this assumption. The first few visits were purely transactional. He came in, stated what he needed, they handled it efficiently, he paid and left. He was not a man who talked for the sake of it, which Eleanor found refreshing rather than off-putting. In her experience, the people who filled silence with chatter were usually filling it because the silence made them uncomfortable. And the silence usually made them uncomfortable because they weren't sure what to do with a woman who didn't need them to. On his fourth visit, something shifted slightly. He had come in for a specific size of bolt that she wasn't certain she had in stock, and she was going through the back bins looking for it, and he had come through the back room without being asked because it was faster, and he seemed to understand this. While she worked through the bins, he was looking at the organization of the back room. She had finished the reorganization by then, and he said without much inflection, "That's a smart system. Product weight at the bottom, frequency of access on the main shelves." "You work with supply operations at other ranches?" she asked. "Indirectly. Foreman work means knowing what a place needs and when. I've been in enough supply rooms to know what works and what doesn't. Most people don't notice the back room. Most people aren't thinking about it from a logistics perspective." She found the bolt, held it up. "That's the one," he said. She came back to the counter. As she was wrapping the bolt to prevent it from scratching against the other items he was purchasing, she said, "How long have you been doing foreman work?" 12 years, more or less. Started as a handout of Oklahoma Territory when I was about 20. Worked my way up through a couple different operations. What brought you to Dry Creek? A brief pause. Not the evasive kind, just the kind where someone was deciding how specific to be. Wanted somewhere to stop moving, he said. Spent most of my adult life picking up and moving on. Good work here. Operation Solid seemed like a place with some staying power. Dry Creek's been here 40 years, Eleanor said. For Texas, that counts as permanent. Something around his eyes shifted. A very slight adjustment that might have been the beginning of something like amusement. That's a fair characterization. He paid, took his items, and left. Eleanor stood at the counter for a moment after he'd gone, the way she sometimes did when something was on the edge of her thinking that she hadn't fully gotten to yet. Then Caleb came in from the side door with a question about the Thursday inventory, and she turned her attention to that, and the half-formed thought dispersed like smoke. The thing about Dry Creek was that it watched. That was its primary occupation, after commerce and weather, the observation and cataloging of what was happening with other people. Information moved through the town the way water moved through limestone, not on the surface, not in any single obvious channel, but seeping through cracks and appearing somewhere unexpected, slightly changed by the process. Eleanor had lived with this her whole life and had long since stopped being surprised by it. She had developed a kind of immunity to it, or what she thought of as immunity, which was really more like a practiced indifference, a disciplined not checking for what people were, saying that allowed her to function without spending half her mental energy anticipating the next thing. But Dry Creek noticed Rhett Mercer before she had reason to think about it much. He was a stranger, which automatically generated curiosity. He was unmarried, which generated a different kind. And he was apparently making regular trips to Hartwell Supply when the General Hardware carried most of the basic ranch supplies, which generated the kind that got people talking. She became aware of this about 2 weeks in, when Agnes Pell came into the store for the first time in approximately 3 years. Eleanor noted the arrival with a very slight internal bracing, the way your body automatically adjusts its footing on uncertain ground, and was professionally pleasant throughout the transaction, which involved a quantity of spice tins that Agnes could have purchased at 3 other establishments more conveniently located to her house. Agnes was 60-something, silver-haired, with the kind of upright posture that came from decades of considering it a moral position. She paid for her spices, then stood at the counter approximately 3 seconds longer than the transaction required, which Eleanor recognized as deliberate. "I hear you've had a good deal of business from the Roper's Creek operation," Agnes said. "Supply business," Eleanor said. "They're outfitting a working ranch. Yes. The foreman comes in himself, I understand. Not a hand." "Mr. Mercer manages the purchasing for the operation," Eleanor said. Her voice was completely level. "Which is typical for a foreman." Agnes made a small noise that wasn't agreement. "Seems an unusual amount of personal attention for a supply relationship." "I have a number of accounts where the owner or manager comes in directly," Eleanor said. "It's more efficient, fewer miscommunications." "Of course." Agnes picked up her bag. "I'm sure that's all it is." She left. Eleanor looked at the door for a moment after it closed. "I could lose her order," Caleb offered from somewhere in the back. "She paid cash," Eleanor said. "So technically there is no order." "I could still—" No. But she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, in small fragments between other tasks. Not about Agnes Pell specifically, but about what Agnes Pell represented, which was the town, in its official observational capacity, beginning to form a narrative. Eleanor had been through this before. She knew exactly how it went. Someone new came to town, there was a period of assessment, and if there was any intersection between the new person and Eleanor, that intersection became a story. The stories never ended particularly well for Eleanor. In their telling, she was always either too eager, desperate was the word people used when they were being less than kind, or too cold, or too calculating, or too something. The story was always about what was wrong with her, the reason it wouldn't work, the evidence that she was exactly as the town had always understood her to be. She was not going to think about this. She was not going to let a man who came in to buy lamp oil and rope become something she thought about. She closed out the register, locked up the store, and walked home in the early evening light with her spine very straight and her jaw set and a deep, deliberate absence of thought on the subject. The following week, Rhett Mercer came in on a Tuesday morning and asked her, at the end of the transaction, whether she knew of a good place to eat that wasn't the boarding house. Eleanor looked at him. "Clara's on the south end of 2nd Street," she said. "Hash and eggs in the morning, decent supper. The boarding house is better at breakfast." He nodded. "Thanks." Then after a beat, "You eat at Clara's?" "On occasion." Another beat. He was looking at the counter, not at her, in the thoughtful way of someone deciding something. "I'll be there Thursday evening," he said, "around 6. If you happen to be there at the same time, I'd not object to the company." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze, not with bravado, not with the particular quality that some men used when they were trying something on and wanted to see if it would land. The studied casualness that was really anything but casual. He just looked at her, level and honest, like a man who had said a thing he meant and was waiting to find out what the other person thought about it. "I usually eat at home on Thursdays," she said. "All right." He picked up his purchase, no change in his expression. "Just thought I'd mention it." He left. Eleanor stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then Caleb, who had with suspicious precision been occupied with a shelf directly within earshot, cleared his throat. "Don't," Eleanor said. "I didn't say anything," Caleb said. "You were thinking loudly." Caleb turned back to his shelf. But she could see, from the angle she had on him, the very deliberate effort he was making not to smile. Eleanor sat down at the counter, picked up her pen, set it down. She thought about Norma Wells and Agnes Pell and Martha Giles and Frank Decker and every person who had ever said too much and meant it as a verdict. She thought about the particular way this town told stories about her, the shape those stories always took, the way they always arrived at the same conclusion, like water finding the lowest point. She thought about a man who shook her hand without thinking about it, who said Hartwell, then without making it a thing, who had noticed the logic of her backroom organization and said so with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who found competence interesting rather than threatening. She thought about Thursday evening. She thought about 6 o'clock. She picked up her pen again, put it down again, picked it up. "Caleb," she said. "Yep." "Do you know anything about Rhett Mercer from the Roper's Creek spread?" A pause that contained, Eleanor was fairly certain, the entirety of everything Caleb thought about this question and was wisely choosing not to say. "Only that he pays on time," Caleb said finally, "and he doesn't talk more than he needs to. And he asked me last week which of the coffees we stocked was the best quality one." Eleanor looked up. "He asked you?" "I was stacking. You were with another customer." Caleb aligned a can with the precision of someone being very casual. Seemed like a practical question. Eleanor turned back to the counter, looked at her ledger. The numbers were clear and honest and gave her nothing useful whatsoever. "People are going to talk," she said, mostly to herself. "People already talk," Caleb said, equally to himself, or possibly to the can he was aligning. "You've never particularly cared about that before." Eleanor said nothing. The light through the front window was the particular quality of late morning in spring, clear and unambiguous. The kind of light that didn't allow for much softening. It lay across the counter in a plain rectangle, illuminating the grain of the worn wood, the ledger with its columns of honest numbers, the pen she kept picking up and setting down. She thought about a man who said I'd not object to the company in the tone of someone telling a simple truth. She wrote exactly nothing for the next 4 minutes. Then she made a decision that she would not, even in the privacy of her own head, allow herself to call anything other than what it was, practical. She would go to Clara's on Thursday at 6 o'clock because she was occasionally tired of eating alone, and Clara made a good pork supper, and there was nothing wrong with that, and anyone who suggested otherwise could form their own opinions, which they would do regardless. She picked up her pen. She wrote. The morning light held steady, fell where it fell, illuminating without judgment the plain geometry of a woman at her counter, doing her work, deciding something small and enormous at the same time. Outside, somewhere on Main Street, the town of Dry Creek went about its business. The horses stamped and the doors opened and closed and the voices carried in the warm air. A town that had always known exactly what it thought about Eleanor Hartwell, what she was worth and what she was too much of, and what would become of a woman like her. It had been very certain about this for a very long time. It was, though nobody knew it yet, about to begin to find out how wrong it had been. Thursday came the way Thursdays in Dry Creek usually did, workmanlike, unremarkable, offering no particular sign that anything about it intended to be different from the Thursdays that had come before it. Eleanor spent the day doing exactly what she always did. She opened the store at 7. She reconciled 2 outstanding accounts. She helped a ranch wife select between 2 grades of oilcloth and did not volunteer her personal opinion on the matter until the woman asked, at which point she gave it directly, which was the only way Eleanor knew how to give opinions. She ate a sandwich at the counter around noon, standing up because sitting down to eat alone in the back room was something she occasionally did, but only when she genuinely needed the quiet. And today she wasn't sure what she needed. Caleb said nothing about Thursday evening. He was careful in this way, Caleb. He had an instinct for when silence was the more useful contribution, which was unusual in a 15-year-old, and Eleanor considered it one of his most valuable qualities. He did his work, kept his counsel, and at 4:30 said good evening and let himself out through the back. Eleanor closed up at 6. Standard closing time, nothing unusual about it. She locked the front, walked to the back, took off her work apron, and hung it on its hook. Washed her hands and face at the basin. Changed into the gray dress she kept on the hook behind the backroom door for occasions that required her to be presentable without making a production of being presentable. She stood for a moment looking at herself in the small mirror she'd put up above the basin about 3 years ago, primarily for practical purposes, checking for ink on her face, that kind of thing. The gray dress was plain and good. She looked like herself. That was fine. That was the only thing she knew how to look like, so it was going to have to be fine. She walked to Clara's. Clara Beaumont's place had been a fixture on 2nd Street since before Eleanor was born. A narrow building with a deep front porch and yellow curtains in the windows that Clara washed every other week with a regularity that bordered on devotion. Clara herself was 60 and built like someone who had spent a lifetime carrying things, which she had, and she ran her establishment with a blunt warmth that Eleanor had always appreciated. Clara did not make a ceremony of anything. She fed people, she took their money, she told them plainly if she'd run out of something, and she expected them to behave like adults in her establishment. Eleanor had always found this arrangement congenial. The supper crowd was moderate when she arrived. 5 or 6 tables occupied, the usual mix of townspeople and the occasional traveler. The smell was pork and something with onions and fresh bread, which was better than average. Eleanor looked around once, briefly, the way she always looked around when she entered a room, categorizing who was present. Rhett Mercer was at the table in the far left corner, with his back to the wall and a clear line of sight to the door. He was reading something, a folded paper of some kind, a letter, or a notice. And he didn't look up immediately when she came in, which she appreciated. She walked toward the table without hurrying and pulled out the chair across from him without ceremony. He looked up then, folded the paper and set it in his shirt pocket. "Hartwell," he said. "Mercer," she said. Neither of them made anything of the fact that she had come. Clara's daughter Bess appeared and took their orders. The pork for Eleanor, a beef plate for Rhett, coffee for both, and departed with the efficiency that was apparently hereditary in the Beaumont family. There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like 2 people deciding what kind of conversation they were going to have. "How is the fence line?" Eleanor asked. "Worse than expected, better than feared," he said. 40 yards of the north section needs full replacement. The rest is repairable. We got the west side done before the rain hit on Tuesday." "That's the double-braided rope." "Still holding. Good product." "I know," she said, which wasn't vanity, just accuracy, and he seemed to receive it as such. The coffee came. Eleanor drank hers without additions. Rhett added a small amount of sugar, the same way she'd noticed him doing it the one other time she'd been present when he had coffee at the counter, which she was now aware she had apparently noticed and filed without consciously meaning to. "How long have you had the store?" he asked. 5 years alone. Was working it with my father for 3 before that." "You grew up here?" "Born here, except for a year in San Antonio at 17 when I lived with my cousin and considered whether I wanted to stay." She didn't usually say this much about her history. It came out with a matter-of-factness that surprised her slightly. "What made you come back?" She considered the honest answer to this, which was complicated. "My father needed help, and I had unfinished business with the store. And San Antonio." She paused. San Antonio is a city where a woman can disappear into the general noise. I wasn't sure that was what I wanted. Rhett looked at her, not with the particular thoughtful nod of someone processing what you said and preparing to redirect to themselves, but with the attentive quality of someone who was actually listening and waiting to see if there was more. Here you can't disappear, she said, which has advantages and disadvantages. More of one than the other? She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. Depends on the day. The food came and they ate, and the conversation moved in the straightforward way of two people who were not trying to impress each other, which was, Eleanor found, considerably easier than most conversations she had. He talked about the Roper's Creek operation with the practical specificity of someone who actually understood ranching, not performing knowledge, just applying it. He asked questions about the regional supply network, who the reliable distributors were, where the weak points in the usual supply chains tended to fall. She answered honestly, including the parts that weren't flattering to her own suppliers, because lying about it would have been both useless and uninteresting. At some point, she noticed that the table near the door, occupied by Helen Foss and her sister-in-law, both of whom Eleanor knew by name and reputation, had developed a particular quality of apparent nonchalance that was, in Eleanor's experience, the social presentation of people who were paying extremely close attention. Helen Foss was not a malicious woman. She was, however, someone who experienced other people's lives with considerable vicarious investment, and she had a gift for being able to hold a conversation while simultaneously absorbing everything happening in her peripheral vision. Eleanor noted this and said nothing about it. "You ever think about expanding?" Rhett asked. He was mopping the last of the sauce from his plate with a piece of bread, with the pragmatic lack of ceremony of a man who didn't eat in places with tablecloths often enough to feel self-conscious about it. Expanding how? Second location. Or a different product line. The dry goods market out here has gaps. I saw it coming in from the east. Smaller settlements between here and the county seat that can't get supply reliably. Eleanor looked at him. I've thought about it. But running one operation well is harder than it looks. And a second location means a manager I can trust, which is a more limited resource than capital or inventory. She paused. Also, she stopped. Also what? She decided to say it because being indirect about things was a habit she'd never acquired and wasn't going to start now. People in this town have a particular view of what I should and shouldn't be doing with the store. A woman running one location is acceptable, if barely. 2 locations starts to feel like something that makes people uncomfortable. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He set down the bread, looked at the table, then looked at her. Does that usually stop you? What makes people uncomfortable? No, she said. Then why mention it? It was a fair question. She thought about it honestly. Because it costs something, she said. Even when you don't let it stop you, it costs something. I wanted to be accurate about that. He looked at her for a moment with that level quality she was becoming familiar with. The way he looked at things when he was actually thinking about them rather than formulating a response. That's fair, he said. That was all. Not I understand with the particular warmth of someone performing understanding, not I'm sure it's not as bad as you think with the well-meaning dismissiveness of someone who hadn't lived it, just that's fair. An acknowledgement of the thing she'd said as a thing that was real. Eleanor drank her coffee, said nothing. The sensation in her chest was unfamiliar and she filed it under things to think about later, which was where she put things she didn't have immediate words for. Helen Foss, near the door, had her head turned approximately 15 degrees further toward the window than the content of her conversation required. Eleanor paid for her own meal without discussion, and so did Rhett pay for his, which she appreciated, because she had been prepared for the negotiation and the absence of it was easier. They walked out onto 2nd Street together into the warm May evening, the sky still holding a band of deep orange above the western ridge. Rhett stopped on the porch and looked at it for a moment with the posture of someone who had spent enough time outdoors to actually notice the sky rather than just be under it. I'll be at the store Monday, he said. We need to talk through the lumber order for the barn repair. I'll have the distributor's catalog ready, she said. We can price it out properly. Good. He looked at her briefly, directly. Thank you for the company. It was a supper, Eleanor said, not an event. The corner of his mouth moved very slightly. No, he agreed. It was a supper. He walked in the direction of the livery, where she assumed his horse was stabled. Eleanor walked home. She told herself, with some conviction, that it had been perfectly ordinary. She believed this about 40%. The remaining 60% she put in the same file as everything else. The town noticed. Of course it did. Eleanor had known it would and had prepared herself for it and had decided she didn't care. And she did not care. But she was aware of it, which was a different thing. Awareness was not the same as caring. You could be aware of weather without caring about it, Norma Wells asked, in an elaborately casual way, about the new foreman from Roper's Creek, the next time Eleanor saw her on the street. Eleanor answered directly that she had a business account with the Roper's Creek operation and left it at that. Agnes Pell came into the store twice the following week for items that seemed selected for their thinness as pretexts. Bill Kramer, at the saddle shop, made a comment to someone who made a comment to someone else that got back to Eleanor in the imprecise, third-hand way that such things always did. Something about unlikely and watch how it ends, which Eleanor did not spend mental energy on. What she did not expect was Norma Wells appearing in the store on a Wednesday morning with the particular expression of someone who believed they were performing an act of kindness. Norma was 61, stout, with hair so consistently and so perfectly silver white that Eleanor had always suspected it had been that color since Norma's 20s, as a matter of personality rather than age. She had a generous streak that coexisted comfortably with her tendency to manage other people's business. She genuinely believed, Eleanor thought, that she meant well. This did not make the results of her good intentions less problematic. She came in, made a legitimate purchase of candle wax and one of the better grade of tin coffee pots, and then stood at the counter. "I want to say something," Norma said, "and I want you to know I'm saying it as someone who has watched you for a long time and has a genuine affection for you, Eleanor." Eleanor looked at her. She was very still, the way she got when something was coming that she needed to receive without reacting to. "I know things are... There have been some dinners, apparently, with the foreman from Roper's Creek." Norma's voice had the gentle, preemptive quality of someone explaining the nature of cold water before you got in it. "And I'm sure he's a decent man, but Eleanor..." She paused, seemed to choose her next words. "Men like that. Men who come from somewhere else, who don't understand the way of things here. They don't always know what they're getting into." "Getting into," Eleanor repeated. "I just mean..." Norma gestured, slightly, the kind of gesture that stands in for a sentence someone doesn't want to finish. "You are a particular kind of woman. You're strong, and you're capable, and that's... Nobody denies that. But men have... There are expectations. And a man who seems interested now might find, once he's more settled, once people have talked to him and he understands..." She stopped, started again. "I would hate to see you hurt, is all." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the many things she could say. She sorted through them with some speed because she was a fast thinker, and anger made her faster. "Norma," she said finally. Her voice was absolutely level. "When was the last time anyone warned a man about me? To protect him?" Norma blinked. "I don't..." "Because I've heard the warnings go the other direction," Eleanor said. "I've heard men warned about me. Too sharp, too tall, too capable. But the framing is always what's wrong with me. The suggestion is that I should prepare myself for disappointment, or that I should be grateful, or that I should adjust myself somehow to be more palatable." She paused. "You're telling me that a man who gets to know me better will decide I'm not worth the trouble, and you're presenting that as looking out for me." Norma looked genuinely uncomfortable. To her credit, she did not immediately argue. She stood with it for a moment, which Eleanor noticed. "I know you didn't mean it as an insult," Eleanor said, "but it is one. A polite one, but still." She put her hands flat on the counter. "Is there anything else you need today?" Norma shook her head, took her purchases. At the door she paused. "I'm sorry," she said, and she seemed to mean it, which was something. "I know," Eleanor said. After Norma left, Eleanor stood at the counter for a full minute, not working, just standing. She was not, she told herself, upset. She had heard versions of this her whole life, and she was not upset. The tightness in her chest said something slightly different, but she overruled it. Caleb, who had been in the back with the inventory sheet and had therefore heard none of this, reappeared with a question about the Thursday count. Eleanor answered it, and they got back to work. So Monday came. Rhett arrived at the store at 9:30 with the practicality of a man who had actually reviewed what he needed before coming in, which she'd noticed was characteristic of him. Some people arrived at a supply store the way they arrived at a conversation, with only a general sense of what they wanted and an expectation that the process of figuring it out would be collaborative. Rhett came in with specifics and adjusted from there. This made him efficient to work with. They went through the distributor catalog for the lumber order, which took about 40 minutes. It was a legitimate and substantive process. The barn repair had complexity to it, the span widths mattered, the grade of timber affected the load bearing, and there were trade-offs between cost and delivery time that required actual thought. Rhett had sketched a rough diagram of the barn structure on a piece of paper that he'd folded into his pocket, and he spread this on the counter between them, and they worked from it, which Eleanor appreciated. Concrete information was better than descriptions. At one point, they disagreed about the beam grade. Rhett favored a lighter grade that would come in 10 days faster. Eleanor thought the heavier grade was worth the weight given the span. For 22 feet, you need the margin, she said. The lighter grade is rated for it, but barely. A bad winter in 2 years, and you're doing this again. Delivery time matters. We're running repairs through June because the eastern pasture work has to come first. Then sequence it properly. Start with the repairs you can do while the lumber's on order. She pointed at his diagram. This whole east section doesn't require the heavy beams. You can work it for 2 weeks while the main order comes in. He looked at the diagram. She could see him thinking through it, actually running the logistics rather than defending a position. She waited. That works, he said. You're right about the grade. She wrote up the order. As she was finishing, he said without particular lead-up, Norma Wells came to see you. Eleanor looked up. How do you know that? She came to see me first. He said it with the flatness of someone reporting a fact, not seeking a reaction. Came out to Roper's Creek last Friday morning. Said she wanted to make sure I understood the situation in town. Eleanor set down her pen. What situation? Apparently, I should know that you are... He paused, and she could see him choosing words with some care, not because he was uncomfortable, but because he was trying to be accurate. She said you were a difficult person, and that most men found you hard to be around over time, and that I was new here and didn't have the full picture. The silence in the store was very complete for a moment. Somewhere outside, a horse moved on the street. And, Eleanor said, her voice was even. She had years of practice with even. And I thanked her for coming and told her I was capable of forming my own opinions about people I'd actually spent time with. He picked up the catalog, found his place, didn't make a production of it. I thought you should know she'd been there, since she'd likely been here too. Eleanor looked at him. He was examining the catalog with the attention of someone who genuinely needed to find a page, not someone performing nonchalance. You could have not told me, she said. Sure, he said, but that seemed like the kind of thing that tends to come out eventually and is better said directly. He looked up. I don't like when people manage information about me. Seemed fair to assume you might feel similarly. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the morning traffic of Dry Creek moved in its ordinary patterns. The horses and the wagons and the voices that carried the particular weight of a place that had already decided what it thought about most things. She thought about Norma, who meant well and had done it anyway. She thought about the shape of a story this town had been telling about her for 28 years. She thought about a man who had sat at a table in Clara's and said that's fair when she told him the truth about something. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply, without layers, which was not something she offered easily. He nodded once. What's the delivery time on the heavy grade? 12 days from confirmed order. Do it, he said. She wrote up the order. They finished the transaction, and he paid the deposit and left. And Eleanor stood at the counter after he was gone and let herself notice, clearly, without trying to immediately categorize it into something manageable, that something was happening that she did not have a familiar framework for. She had met men who were charmed by her initially and recalibrated when the novelty wore off. She had met men who were intimidated from the start and never recovered. She had met men who treated her as a curiosity, men who talked at her, men who were kind in the abstract, but didn't know what to do with her in the specific. She had not particularly met a man who simply proceeded, who showed up, did the actual thing, disagreed with her when he thought she was wrong and changed his position when the evidence warranted it, and told her directly what she needed to know without decorating it. She had not met that before, or not that she could clearly remember. The thought was not comfortable exactly. Comfort was not the right word. It was more like the feeling of a window being opened in a room you'd been in so long you'd stop noticing the air. She was not sure she wanted it opened. She was not sure she wanted it closed. She picked up her pen, wrote the date on the order form, and moved on. May turned into June with the unhurried inevitability of Texas spring becoming Texas summer. The heat arriving not suddenly, but by increment, accumulating each day until one morning you woke up and it was simply hot in a way it hadn't been before and was going to stay. Rhett kept coming to the store. The account was by now properly established. She had set it up, run the credit history she required of all new accounts, found it without issues, and extended the standard terms. There was legitimate business to conduct. The Ropers Creek spread was in a period of significant investment, and that meant regular purchasing. This was the plain, ordinary fact of it. And then there was the rest of it, which was less easy to categorize. He came in Tuesday mornings with some consistency, and the transactions had a way of running longer than strictly required. Not because either of them was inefficient, but because conversation happened. She found herself noting things during the week that she thought he might find interesting or useful. A notice about a county road closure that would affect his supply runs. An item in the distributor catalog about a new type of fence wire that would be relevant to the Ropers Creek work. She didn't examine why she noted these things. She simply noted them. He appeared to do something similar. He mentioned on a Tuesday in late May that he'd heard about a land dispute to the west that might affect one of her supplier routes. He had no particular reason to know this affected her, except that he'd been paying attention. They went to Clara's again. Then once to the hotel dining room, which was a different kind of occasion. The hotel dining room was where people went when they were making a statement, whether they intended to or not. Eleanor had been aware of this when she agreed to it, which she supposed meant she had made a decision of some kind without fully admitting it to herself. The town was fully invested now. She could feel it in the particular quality of attention that followed her on the street. Not hostile, not exactly, but watchful in the specific way of a place that had already written the story and was watching events to see if they'd have the grace to conform to it. The story, as Eleanor understood it in its current telling, was the foreman would realize, eventually. He was new. He didn't have context. Once he understood what Eleanor Hartwell actually was, so too sharp, too independent, too certain of herself, too much, he would recalibrate, as all of them had, and the town would be able to say, with the gentle satisfaction of the confirmed, that it had known all along. Eleanor knew this story. She had lived through it twice before, with two different men who had genuinely, she believed, meant well at the outset, and who had each found, in different ways and at different speeds, that she was more than they knew how to hold. The first time she had been 22. His name was Walter Price, a school teacher who had come down from Austin with genuine warmth and an appreciation for her mind that had felt for about 7 months like something real. He had left at the end of the school year, citing the opportunity of a position back north. The real reason, which she'd understood without being told, was that she had disagreed with him in public twice and he had found it harder to recover from than he expected. The second time, she had been 25. James Ellison, whom Norma had mentioned without naming the other week. 3 months. He had been straightforward about it at the end, to his credit, told her honestly that he'd thought he could manage her independence, and had found, in practice, that he felt unnecessary. She hadn't known what to do with that, then or now. The idea that a man might find himself unnecessary because she was capable of running her own life. These were not dramatic stories. They were quiet ones, which in some ways made them harder to carry. No villains, no great wrongs, just two people who had found that the thing they'd both hoped for didn't quite fit the reality they were each living in. Eleanor had made conclusions from this. Not bitter ones, or she tried not to let them be bitter. She was suspicious of bitterness on principle, found it a waste of mental energy. But the conclusions had been there, that she was a particular kind of person, that this particular kind of person paired well with independence and poorly with the compromises that belonging to someone required, and that the most sensible thing was to accept this and build a life accordingly. She had built a good life. She kept telling herself this, and it was true. It just wasn't complete, which was a different thing from being good. She was thinking about this one evening in mid-June when there was a knock at the back door of her house, the house attached to the back of the store property, which people in town knew was hers and knew how to find, though it wasn't common for people to knock on it directly rather than coming through the store. She opened the door. Rhett Mercer was standing on her back step, hat in hand, with the particular posture of a man who had decided to do something and had arrived to do it. "This isn't a business call," he said. "I gathered," Eleanor said. "Can I come in?" She held the door open. He came into her kitchen and stood in it with the slightly careful quality of a man aware he was in someone else's private space and was being respectful of that. He looked around the kitchen briefly. The yellow walls her mother had painted, the plain, heavy table, the window over the basin with its view of the back lot. He did not comment on any of it. "I wanted to say something directly," he said, "rather than in a store or a restaurant or any other place where the method of delivery matters more than what's being delivered." Eleanor leaned against the counter and looked at him. "All right. I've been coming to your store for 6 weeks," he said, "for business and otherwise. I'm aware the town has a view on that, and I'm aware that view has probably been communicated to you in detail. I'm not interested in the town's view." He paused. He was looking at her directly, steadily, the way he looked at things when he was being precise about them. "I'm interested in whether you'd be willing to continue, whatever this has been, with the understanding that I know what I'm doing and I'm not going to change my mind because someone at the boarding house tells me something I should watch out for." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the June evening was settling into its long, warm dark. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Walter Price and James Ellison and the particular shape of 2 quiet stories that had ended in the same place. She thought about what Norma Wells had said, what Agnes Pell had implied, what Frank Decker had said once that she wasn't supposed to hear. She thought about a man who had said that's fair and then gone back to the work. "You should know," she said, "that 2 men before you had the same confidence at the outset." "I know," he said. "People have told me. And I'm not them." He said it without inflection, without particular heat, just as a fact that he was placing on the table for her consideration. "I'm not comparing myself to men I've never met. I'm telling you what I know about myself, which is that I'm not easily unsettled, and I don't make decisions based on what other people think I should want." Eleanor said nothing. The tightness in her chest was there again, the familiar one, but different from usual. Less like weather she was adjusting her coat to, and more like something with actual weight, pressing against something that had been very carefully sealed for a long time. "I'm also not asking you to do anything right now except not close a door that doesn't need to be closed yet," he said. "I'm 35 years old, and I've spent most of my life moving from place to place, and I'm not in the habit of announcing things I'm not sure of. I'm sure of this." She looked at him for a long moment. "The town is going to watch every move we make," she said. "I know. And they're going to have opinions." "They already do," he said. "I haven't found it particularly relevant." She pushed off from the counter, moved to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee that she'd kept warm from supper, set one on the table, and kept the other. She looked at him standing in her kitchen with his hat still in his hand, and the June dark coming in through the window, and the yellow walls her mother had painted around both of them. "Sit down then," she said. He sat. She sat across from him, and they drank their coffee, and outside the town of Dry Creek moved through its evening in its customary rhythms, certain of things it thought it knew, settling into its opinions like a man into a well-worn chair. Inside the yellow kitchen, nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been promised. Something small and significant had simply been left open, like a door that didn't need to be closed yet. And for now, just for this evening, Eleanor let it stay that way. The coffee in Eleanor's kitchen that evening lasted 2 hours. They didn't talk about anything particularly significant. That was the thing she kept returning to afterward, in the odd, quiet moments between customers at the store or in the early morning before she unlocked the front door. They had talked about practical things. The supply route changes coming with the summer schedule. A book she'd been reading, a history of the cattle trade that had come in with a shipment and caught her eye. His years working a spread in Oklahoma where the winters had been genuinely brutal in a way that Texas cold didn't quite match. She had told him about the year she'd spent in San Antonio, the part she hadn't mentioned at Clara's, the way the city had felt enormous and anonymous after Dry Creek, how she'd found it both exhilarating and quietly terrifying, how she'd stood on a street corner one October afternoon watching the traffic and realized she was homesick for a town she'd been trying to decide whether to leave. "What made you homesick?" he'd asked. She'd thought about it. "The store," she said, which probably sounds honest, he said. They'd sat with that for a moment, both of them looking at the table or the coffee or some middle distance, and it hadn't been uncomfortable. He'd left a little after 9. Stood at the back door, put his hat on, and said he'd be in Tuesday for the fence post order. She'd said she'd have the count ready. And that was that. The ordinary transaction attached to the end of the non-ordinary evening, like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone somewhere unexpected. She had stood in her kitchen after the door closed and listened to the sound of his horse moving down the back lane, and she had thought very deliberately and clearly that she was not going to make a project out of this. She was not going to dissect it, was not going to hold each moment up to examination, was not going to build a structure of expectation from 2 hours of coffee in a yellow kitchen. She was also not going to pretend it hadn't happened, which would have required a level of self-deception she didn't have the equipment for. It had happened. Something was happening. She did not know what shape it would take or whether its shape would be one she recognized or one that would surprise her. And she was not, she told herself with some firmness, going to spend the next 3 weeks finding out in her head before it had a chance to find out in fact. She went to bed. She slept adequately. She opened the store at 7 the next morning. She was fine. June in Dry Creek had its own specific weight. The heat settled in like a tenant who had no plans to leave, and the town adjusted its rhythms accordingly. Earlier starts, longer midday pauses, the particular patience of people who had grown up in this climate and understood that fighting it was a choice you made at your own expense. The dust on Main Street took on a different quality in summer, finer and more persistent, finding its way into everything regardless of what you did about it. Eleanor kept a damp cloth near the front counter and wiped down the display shelves every morning. It was a losing battle, but she fought it on principle. Business was steady, as it tended to be in early summer. The ranches were in their active season, which meant regular purchasing, and the town itself was in the restless productive mode that came with long days and a sense, however illusory, that things were moving and could be moved. Eleanor liked this time of year, practically speaking. She liked busy. What she did not like was the conversation she had with Doc Giles on a Thursday afternoon. Martin Giles was the town's physician, the only one within 40 miles, a fact that gave him a position of authority that he generally used with more sense than Eleanor might have expected from someone with that much unchecked social power. He was a decent man, 50-something, with a direct quality she respected. His wife Martha was the one who had stood in her store with Norma Wells and talked about calculation, and Eleanor had separated the husband from the wife on this, as she generally tried to do. People were responsible for themselves. Doc Giles came in for the standard medical supply order. She stocked a modest selection of things the local doctor needed, bandaging and carbolic acid and some of the more stable preparations, and conducted that business efficiently. Then he stood at the counter with his bag of purchases and looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision to say something. "Mercer's a good man," he said. "From what I can tell." Eleanor looked at him. "All right, I'm not here to warn you about him," he said preemptively, and she appreciated the preemption. "I've heard enough warning delivered in your direction to know it's not something you need from me." He paused. "I wanted to say something different." "Then say it." He picked up his bag, set it down again. "This town has not been fair to you," he said, "in the specific way I'm thinking of. There's a kind of woman we understand here, and you've never been quite that kind, and we've held that against you for a long time without being willing to say so out loud. Martha included." He said his wife's name without apology and without excessive weight on it, just placed it there, accurately. "I don't know what happens with Mercer, but whatever happens, I didn't want the accumulation of everyone else's opinion to become the thing that determined it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Martin Giles was not a man who made speeches. She had known him for 15 years, and this was probably the longest consecutive number of sentences she had ever heard him produce on a personal subject. "Thank you, Martin," she said. He nodded, picked up his bag, left. Eleanor stood at the counter for a while after that, not thinking about anything in particular, which was itself unusual. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with the dust motes above the front window display. Caleb, emerging from the back with a question about the salt inventory, took one look at her face and asked the question and retreated when she answered it, without comment. She appreciated that about Caleb. Boss. The first public moment, the one that got talked about, that people would reference later with the specific precision of people who had been there or wished they had been, happened on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of June. Saturdays were the busiest day. Main Street carried its full complement of traffic. Ranch hands in for their weekly supplies, families making the trip from the surrounding areas, the particular social energy of a day that functioned as the town's weekly gathering point. Eleanor worked Saturdays without Caleb, who had family obligations, and the pace was demanding enough that she didn't think about much except the work. She was managing 3 customers at once, a reasonable skill she had developed over years. When the front door opened and Frank Decker came in, which was unusual because Frank Decker had not been in her store in approximately 2 years, having taken his business to Garvey's Hardware over some disagreement about pricing that Eleanor barely remembered. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a reddish face that deepened when he was irritated, which in Eleanor's experience was frequently. Behind him, she registered, was Rhett Mercer. They had apparently arrived in proximity but not together. Rhett had been coming from the direction of the post office and Frank from the livery, and they had converged at the door more or less simultaneously. Frank had come in first. Rhett came in and stood to the side, assessing what was open at the counter with the patience of a man who was in no hurry. Eleanor finished the transaction she was on, moved to the next, kept the pace moving. She was aware of both of them in the room in the way she was always aware of everything in her store, but she did not make a thing of it. Frank moved toward the counter when the customer ahead of him finished. He wanted fence staples, which Garvey's had apparently been out of for a week. The order was simple. Eleanor moved to fill it. "Heard you've been doing a lot of business with Roper's Creek," Frank said, while her back was to him. "I have," she said. She pulled the staple boxes from the shelf. "New foreman. Seems like he's here every other day." Frank said it with the tone of a man making an observation, but the specific quality of tone that communicated the observation was more than an observation. Eleanor set the staples on the counter. "Regular account, busy operation." She named the price. Frank made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Must be the personal service." He said personal service the way people said things when they wanted the words to mean something they weren't saying outright. The store was not empty. There were 3 other customers at various points in the space, and Rhett Mercer was standing 7 feet away. Eleanor looked at Frank Decker with a level and unbroken attention. "Will that be everything?" "Just making conversation," Frank said. "You can make it elsewhere," Eleanor said. "The price is, as I said. Cash, or do you want an account?" Frank's face went slightly more red. "No need to get—" "Frank." Rhett's voice came from the side, and it had a quality Eleanor hadn't heard from him before. Not loud, not aggressive, but with an absolute flatness that communicated very clearly that something was being shut down. "Pay the woman, and let's not do this." A short silence. Frank turned his head toward Rhett. Something passed between them that Eleanor didn't have full visibility on. Some male calculus being conducted. A rapid assessment of who was saying what and what standing they had to say it. She did not require Rhett to do this on her behalf and would have said so if it had gone differently. But it didn't go differently. Frank put his money on the counter without another word. Eleanor counted change without looking at him. He took the staples and left. The other customers had found very interesting things to look at on the shelves during this exchange, and were now resuming normal activity with the particular relieved energy of people glad something was over. Rhett came to the counter. Eleanor looked at him. "I was handling it." "I know," he said. "I wasn't handling it for you. I've got 400 fence staples on the Roper's Creek account, and I didn't want to stand in the same store as a man talking like that for any longer than I had to." She looked at him. He met the look without shifting. "That's a fine distinction," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. She found to her own mild irritation that she believed him. "Same order as last time?" "Plus 20 feet of the double braided." She wrote it up. City by sets. The story of the Saturday exchange moved through Dry Creek with the reliable speed of things that carried a charge. By Sunday, it had been told in at least 4 versions she was aware of. She knew this because people communicated these things to her, directly or indirectly, whether she wanted them to or not. In some versions, Rhett had said considerably more than he had. In some versions, Eleanor had said considerably more. In all versions, Frank Decker came out somewhat diminished, which she did not feel bad about. What she did feel, underneath the plain surface of carrying on with her week, was something that she had difficulty categorizing. Not gratitude exactly. She had been clear with Rhett and with herself that she hadn't needed the intervention, but something adjacent to it. The thing that happened when a person did something not because they were required to, but because they found the situation genuinely intolerable, and the reason it was intolerable was because it involved you, and the reason that mattered was because you mattered to them in a way that was real enough to make them act. She had not felt that from anyone in a long time, not in that specific way. She was thinking about this in the controlled, non-projective way she was trying to think about all of it. On a Sunday evening, when she was sitting at her kitchen table with her cousin May's letter, which she had finally gotten to. May wrote about city life with an affectionate exasperation that Eleanor always found reading like a warm hand on the shoulder. About a third of the way through, May said, "I think about you up there sometimes, Elle, and I wonder if the town still makes things hard for you the way they always did. You were always too much for them. I mean that as the highest compliment. Some people are just more than the space they're given." Eleanor read that twice. Then she folded the letter and held it in her hands and stared at the yellow wall across from her for a while. Too much. She had heard that phrase her whole life as a verdict. May used it as something else entirely, and the difference between those two uses was enormous. Was in fact the difference between a cage and a door. She began composing her reply in her head, the way she always did before she actually wrote letters. She got a page and a half in mentally before she set it aside and went to bed. On a Tuesday in the third week of June, with the heat settled in properly and the mornings already warm before 7, Eleanor was doing the month-end accounts when Rhett came in and they had the argument. It was not a dramatic argument. It was not raised voices or things said that couldn't be taken back. It was the kind of argument that happens between people who are both precise and both certain, which produces a particular friction. The subject was the expansion. He had brought it up again, the idea of a second location, and he'd done it with the slightly different energy of someone who'd been thinking about it outside the context of the original conversation. He had specific thoughts about where, about the supply route logic, about how the staffing model could work. He laid it out concisely, and she listened. Then she said, "The capital doesn't work." "I ran figures," he said. "What figures?" He put a piece of paper on the counter. She looked at it. He had, in fact, run figures, reasonable ones, based on what she'd told him about the store's operation over the course of their conversations. She looked at them carefully, the way she looked at all numbers, without rushing. "You've used the wrong margin on dry goods," she said. "I run tighter than industry standard because I move volume. Your model assumes a 15% margin. I operate at 11. He looked at the numbers. "That's an unusual margin." "It's my margin. I know what it is. Adjusted for 11%, the timeline extends to..." He was doing the math in his head. She could see it. 18 months for break-even instead of 12. 18 months if nothing goes wrong, she said, which something always does. He looked at the figures, looked at her. "You've thought about this more than you've let on." "I think about everything more than I let on," she said. "That's not a new development." There was a beat between them that had a slight edge to it, not hostile, but present. "Why haven't you done it?" he asked. "The expansion. If you've done the analysis, because knowing something is viable on paper and being ready to do it are different things." She looked at him directly. "And because the second thing I said to you the first time we discussed it was true. It costs something in this town to do more than they've decided you should do. That cost is real, even if it doesn't appear in your figures. You're letting them limit you," he said. The tone wasn't accusatory, but it landed. Eleanor set down her pen. She was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was different from her usual quiet. "I am not," she said, with a deliberate evenness, "asking for your judgment on what I'm letting. I've been running this store for 5 years and making these calculations for longer than that, and the calculation includes things you don't have full information on." She paused. "When I ask for your business opinion, I'll do so. In the meantime, I've given you my assessment of the figures. You can agree with it or not." The silence after that had a specific texture. Rhett looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them looked away. Then he picked up the piece of paper, folded it. The figures at 11% still show viability, he said, with a longer timeline. Yes, she said. I was out of line saying what I said. She considered this. You were, she said, but it was the honest version of what you think, which I prefer to the careful version. He was quiet a moment. That's... He stopped. Started again. Most people don't want the honest version. I'm not most people, Eleanor said. No, he said. You're not. There was something in the way he said it that was different from the way people usually said variations of that sentence to her. Usually it was said with a quality of careful neutrality, acknowledging the fact without committing to a view on it. He said it like a statement of preference, like it was the specific thing rather than despite the specific thing. She picked up her pen, found her place in the accounts. After a moment, he said, The fence post order, when it comes in, Thursday, she said. I'll send Caleb with the wagon if you can have a man at the south gate. I'll have someone there. They conducted the remainder of the transaction, and he left, and Eleanor sat with the accounts and the particular residue of an argument that hadn't ended badly, but had gotten close enough to a real edge that it had shown her something. Two things, actually. One, she had not softened the disagreement. She had not managed her response to make it easier for him. She had said what she thought with the same directness she always had, and she had told him clearly when he'd overstepped, and she had watched to see what he did with it. Two, he had not retreated. He had not made the argument about her personality rather than the content of the disagreement. He had acknowledged the overreach and returned to the substance, and the thing between them at the end had not felt broken. She sat with this for a long time after he was gone. Walter Price, at 22, had gone quiet for 3 days the first time she'd openly disagreed with him. She'd thought she was losing him then and had made the mistake of softening her position, and the version of herself she'd performed for the remaining 5 months had been a smaller one. She had not fully admitted this to herself until now, sitting in her store in the June heat with her ledger in front of her, but it was true and she looked at it clearly. James Ellison, at 25, had never argued with her at all, had agreed with everything she said with a pleasantness that had felt generous for the first month and exhausting by the third, because you cannot have an honest conversation with someone who is managing you. Rhett Mercer had told her directly what he thought, had been told he'd overstepped, had said so, and had come back to the work. This was such a simple thing. It shouldn't have been remarkable, and yet she was sitting here, and it was remarkable, and she could not entirely decide what to do with that. She went back to the accounts. She got through them cleanly, found 2 small errors, corrected them, balanced the month. Good numbers. Solid numbers. The store was in excellent shape. She locked up at 6, walked home, made her supper, sat at the table. Outside the kitchen window, the June evening was doing its usual long golden thing, the light staying past 7 and making the back lot look better than it deserved. A mockingbird had taken up residence in the cedar tree at the property line and was running through its repertoire with the thoroughness of a musician who intended to be heard. Eleanor ate her supper and listened to it. It was Caleb who said the thing she hadn't quite let herself say yet. He did it with the oblique sideways approach of someone who had something he wanted to deliver, but enough sense to know the direct route was likely to get it rejected. It was a Wednesday, slow afternoon, the two of them working quietly through the back room, and he had been uncharacteristically thoughtful for about an hour, which Eleanor had noticed and said nothing about because she had learned to let Caleb arrive at things at his own pace. Finally, he said, without looking up from the crate he was sorting, "You're different when he's here." Eleanor didn't stop working. Different how? Not in a, it's not obvious or anything. You're not swooning around. He said the word swooning with the extreme discomfort of a 15-year-old boy in the vicinity of adult feelings. You argue with him. Eleanor looked at him. I argue with lots of people. No, you don't, Caleb said with the calm certainty of someone who had been watching the store floor for a year and a half. You correct people. You disagree with people. But you don't argue. Like it's a real argument between two people who both think they might be right. He aligned a tin. You do that with him. Eleanor was quiet. I'm not trying to, Caleb looked briefly pained. I'm not doing the thing Norma Wells does. I know you're not, Eleanor said. You seem more like yourself, he said. When he's around, which is... He stopped, apparently having reached the edge of his comfort with the subject. Anyway, the canned goods on the third shelf need rotating. The dates are out of order. I know, Eleanor said. I'll do it tomorrow. They went back to work. The afternoon settled back into its quiet. More like yourself. Eleanor turned the phrase over while she worked, examining it the way she examined a figure that didn't immediately resolve. It was specific enough to be interesting, not happier, which would have been the sentimental version, not softer, which would have been the version the town would use if they could see it. More like yourself. As if the self had been running at something less than full, and the presence of a particular person was doing something to the calibration. She didn't know what to do with that either. She was accumulating things she didn't know what to do with at a rate that was beginning to feel like its own kind of pressure. The summer heat outside pressed against the store walls with its indifferent persistence, and the mockingbird in the cedar tree had apparently made up its mind to stay, and Eleanor Hartwell stood in her back room rotating cans with the methodical care she applied to everything, turning each tin to face front, moving the older stock forward, putting the new behind it, the same logic she applied to everything, the sensible ordering of things so that what had been waiting longest came first. What had been waiting longest? She put the last tin in its place and stood back and looked at the shelf, properly ordered now, and thought about a man who said, "I'm not them" without drama, who acknowledged a misstep without retreating, who had sat in her yellow kitchen for 2 hours and talked about ordinary things like it was the most natural arrangement in the world. She thought about a door that didn't need to be closed yet. The thing was, she realized, standing in the warm and dusty back room of the store her father had built, and she had made her own. She hadn't closed it. She had been watching it, had been standing near it with the practiced readiness of a person used to managing her own exits, but she had not closed it. She wasn't sure anymore that she was going to. This was terrifying in the specific way of things that you wanted badly enough that the wanting itself felt like a liability, a point of exposure, a place where the world could get in and do damage. She had kept that point sealed for years, and the sealing had cost her things she hadn't always admitted the cost of. And now she was standing in a back room in June thinking about a man who had folded his paper and said, "That's fair." And the seal was coming loose whether she managed it or not. She went back to the front of the store, took her place at the counter, picked up her pen. Outside on Main Street, Dry Creek moved through its Wednesday afternoon with the steady confidence of a place that had decided most things already and was simply living out the conclusions. It did not know what was happening in Eleanor Hartwell's back room, or in the yellow kitchen, or in the accumulating space between two people who kept finding their way to the same table. It would find out. It always did. But for now the town watched and concluded, and was wrong, in the quiet, fundamental way that towns can be wrong about people for years without knowing it. And Eleanor sat at her counter, and the pen moved, and something that had been sealed for a very long time continued, slowly and without permission, to open. The letter from the distribution company arrived on a Thursday morning in the last week of June, and it was the kind of letter that required Eleanor to sit down. She did not often sit down in the middle of the workday for reasons unrelated to accounts. She was a standing-up person by temperament. She thought better on her feet, worked better, managed the store better from a position that allowed her to move. Sitting felt like conceding something to whatever had made her sit, but she read the letter twice standing up and then pulled the stool out from behind the counter and sat on it, because her legs had done something unreliable. The distributor, Whitmore & Sons, out of San Antonio, the company she'd worked with for 4 years and had renegotiated with twice to get terms that actually reflected the volume she moved, was being acquired. A larger operation out of Houston. The acquisition would close in September. The new ownership intended to consolidate the regional accounts, which meant, reading between the careful language, that smaller independents would be evaluated for continuation or termination based on volume thresholds. The letter did not specify, but implied were significantly higher than what a single location store in a town like Dry Creek could reliably meet. Eleanor read the letter a third time. Then she put it down on the counter and looked at it. 5 years. She had built the store's supply relationship around Whitmore's reliability, around the schedule she'd negotiated, around the credit terms she'd earned through consistent payment and volume growth. The relationship was the infrastructure that made the operation run the way it ran. Losing it wasn't a death sentence. There were other distributors. She had worked with 2 others before settling on Whitmore's, and she knew the landscape. But rebuilding it would take time and capital and negotiation, and she would be doing it from a position of need rather than strength, which was the worst position from which to negotiate anything. She sat with this for approximately 10 minutes. Then she got up, put the letter in the back office in the drawer she kept for things that required extended thought, and went back to work. The morning proceeded. She did not mention the letter to Caleb because there was nothing useful to say yet, and she didn't want to worry him about a situation she hadn't fully evaluated. She finished the account she'd been working on. She helped a rancher's wife pick out curtain fabric with the same attention she always gave the task. She restocked the lamp oil display. She thought about the letter in the way she thought about hard things. Not constantly, but in the regular intervals between tasks, pulling it back and looking at it from a different angle each time. The way you turned a problem over to find where the leverage was. By noon, she had a preliminary assessment. The situation was serious but not catastrophic. She had options. The next 6 weeks before the acquisition closed were an opportunity to open conversations with alternative distributors before she was forced to, which changed the negotiating position considerably. She should also respond to Whitmore's directly and request the specific volume thresholds, because working from implied numbers was worse than working from actual ones. She had a plan. The plan had gaps, but it had a structure. This was manageable. She made herself believe this with the same deliberate effort she applied to most hard things, and by 2 o'clock she mostly did believe it, which was good enough. What she did not anticipate was that Rhett would come in at 3. He wasn't expected. No standing order. No planned transaction. He came in the way he occasionally did on unscheduled visits, with the air of someone who had a reason but wasn't making a ceremony of it. He bought a small quantity of axle grease, asked about the fence staple order for next month. Then he looked at her with the level attention she had come to recognize as his way of noticing something he wasn't going to ignore. "Something's wrong," he said. Not a question. Eleanor considered deflecting. She had a practice deflection. Not a lie, just a redirect, a slight movement toward the surface of things that kept the deeper water out of view. She had used it for years with virtually everyone. "Letter from my distributor," she said. "They're being bought out. The new ownership may not continue small accounts." She watched his face process this. He didn't rush to a response, which she appreciated. He looked at the counter for a moment, the same way he'd looked at the barn diagram when they were working through the lumber order, thinking it through before he spoke. "How dependent are you on Whitmore's specifically?" he asked. "Significantly. Not entirely." "What's the timeline? What's the acquisition closes in September? I have 6 weeks to open conversations with alternatives before the situation becomes urgent." "Have you worked with other distributors before?" 2. One went under. One I moved away from when Whitmore's offered better terms. She paused. "I can rebuild the relationship. It'll cost time and probably a short-term margin hit while I renegotiate." He nodded slowly. "What do you need to get through the next 6 weeks without the margin hit becoming critical?" It was a specific and practical question, and she recognized it as such. Not what can I do to help with its offer of open-ended assistance that required her to direct it. Not, "I'm sorry, that's rough," with its sympathy that didn't have anywhere useful to go. A specific question about a specific need. "Volume certainty," she said. "If I know what I'm moving with confidence, I negotiate from strength. The Ropers Creek account." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence because it led somewhere she hadn't intended to go. "What about it?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to ask you to adjust your purchasing patterns to stabilize my negotiating position. That's not a conversation I'm willing to have." He looked back at her with a slight quality of patience. "I know you're not asking. I'm asking you what the math looks like." "Rhett." "Eleanor." He said her name with a calm that cut through her deflection without force. "You've been helping me run a more efficient ranch operation for 2 months. I know what the Whitmore situation means for your numbers because I know your numbers better than you realize I do. Tell me what the volume certainty needs to look like." She looked at him. "You've been paying that much attention." "I pay attention to things that matter to me," he said, simply and without elaboration. The store was quiet. Mid-afternoon, the slow hour. A horse moved outside on the street. Caleb was in the back, out of earshot. Eleanor picked up her pen, set it down, looked at the counter, then at him. If I knew the Roper's Creek account would hold at current or above through November, she said, that's enough volume certainty to approach the Dallas distributor from a position worth negotiating from. Then it holds, he said. Through November. I'll put it in writing if that helps. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. There's always a difference with you, Eleanor, between what I'm required to do and what I want to do. I'd think by now you'd have noticed that. She had noticed it. She had been very carefully not making too much of it, had been holding it at the careful analytical distance she maintained from things she wanted to be true, but she had noticed it. She said nothing for a moment. The afternoon light through the front window was doing what late June afternoon light did, falling long and golden and slightly tired across the counter, illuminating the plain surfaces of the store with the equanimity of light that didn't favor anything in particular. All right, she said. I'll write it up today, he said. Bring it Tuesday. He paid for the axle grease and left, and Eleanor stood at the counter in the late afternoon light and felt, underneath the concrete and useful shape of a business problem. Finding a solution, something else, something that didn't have a column in her ledger and didn't fit neatly into any of the categories she'd built over years of organizing her life into manageable structures. She felt held, not in the soft, diminishing way of being taken care of. She had never wanted to be taken care of, had always found the idea more suffocating than comforting, held in the other way. The way of being known specifically enough that someone knew what you actually needed and offered that without the performance of assistance, without the requirement that you perform gratitude. She had not felt that before. Not from anyone. Not in this specific form. She put it in the file with the other things she didn't have words for yet, which was getting crowded, and went back to work. What? The written commitment from Rhett arrived Tuesday as promised, folded into an envelope with the Roper's Creek letterhead and signed with a formality that struck her as both businesslike and, in its way, personal. The numbers were precise and fair, not inflated to be generous, just accurate to what the operation actually needed and would continue to need. She read it carefully, found it sound, filed it in the distributor correspondence folder. She wrote a reply to Whitmore's that afternoon requesting the volume thresholds. She drafted the first letter to the Dallas distributor the following morning. By the end of the week, she had 2 conversations in motion and a clearer picture of the landscape. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was navigable, which was the word she preferred to find. She told Caleb about it on Friday. He listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, asked 2 questions that were both good ones, and then said, "Do you need me to do anything different?" She told him no, but that she appreciated the offer. He nodded and went back to work. She did not tell Rhett about the letters because they were her correspondence and her negotiation, and she handled her own business. But she thought quietly that the security of the Roper's Creek account in her folder was the reason the letters were going out with the confidence they carried. And she held that fact with a gratitude she didn't say out loud, but didn't discard either. The conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in early July. It had been building towards something without being anything specific, the way summer weather in Texas built toward a storm. You could feel the pressure accumulating, the air changing quality, the quality of light different in ways you couldn't quite name until the thing finally broke open. They had taken to walking sometimes in the evenings, after supper, when the heat broke slightly and the streets were quieter. It had started practically. They'd both been at Clara's and had walked out at the same time heading in similar directions, and had become a pattern without either of them formally making it one. This was, Eleanor had noticed, characteristic of how things developed between them. No announcements, just the accumulation of small facts into something larger. The evening in question was still warm, but with a thin edge of breeze coming down from the northern ridge, the first suggestion that the season might eventually relent. They were on the road at the east end of town, past the last of the buildings, where the land opened up and you could see the limestone bluffs catching the last light. They had been talking about something else entirely. She could no longer recall what, some question about the county road situation, when Eleanor said, without having fully planned to say it, "Can I ask you something?" Yes, he said. She looked at the bluffs. The light on them was turning from gold to rose, the particular shift that happened in the 10 minutes before it went. She had always liked this light. It made the limestone look like something warmer than it was. The men before you. She stopped, started more precisely. I've had two situations before this, where where things seemed like they might go somewhere. And both times they didn't, for reasons that were essentially about me. Rhett didn't say anything. He kept walking, the same even pace, listening. Walter found me. Difficult, she said. In public. He wanted a woman who would present a certain way. I didn't realize I was presenting differently until he told me, near the end, that he'd thought I could change. She paused. I hadn't thought I needed to. You didn't, Rhett said. I know that now. Then I wasn't sure. She kept her eyes on the bluffs. James was different. He wasn't bothered by my opinions. He was bothered by not feeling needed. He said he felt like something decorative, someone I'd added to a life that didn't require him. Did it? Rhett asked. Require him? She thought about it honestly. I don't think I knew how to make room, she said. I ran a tight operation. My life as well as the store. I knew what every hour was for. I think he would have felt that even if he'd never said so. She stopped walking. He stopped too, half a step later, and turned slightly to look at her. What I'm telling you, she said, is that I'm not an easy person to be with. Not because I'm difficult for the sake of it, but because I take up a certain amount of space and I don't apologize for it, and I don't scale myself down for anyone's comfort. Those aren't things I'm going to change. I know, he said. You say that now, she said. It came out with more weight than she'd intended, the weight of two quiet stories that had ended the same way, the weight of a town that had spent 20 years confirming the conclusion. Everyone says it at the outset. I'm not everyone, he said. You know I'm not. I know you think you're not. She looked at him directly. I know you believe what you're saying. Walter believed it too. James meant it when he said it. People don't usually lie about these things at the start. They discover later that the reality is harder than they'd anticipated. Rhett was quiet for a moment. The light on the bluffs was shifting into its last stage, the rose deepening towards something closer to copper. What would convince you, he asked. Not right now, not tonight. I mean in general. Is there something specific, or is it just time? It was a good question. It was the right question, actually, and the fact that he'd asked it rather than trying to argue her out of the concern told her something. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, she said honestly. I've been trying to figure that out. All right, he said. That's honest. The problem, she said, is that I want to trust it, and wanting to trust it makes me distrust my own judgment, because the wanting is a bias. It makes me more likely to accept evidence I should question and discount evidence that should count. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the shifting light. You're the most methodical person I've ever met, he said, in the way you think about things. Is that a problem? No, he said. I'm just noting it. He turned back toward the bluffs. Then, after a moment, Eleanor, the thing I want to say, and I want to say it right. He stopped, tried again. The town has been telling a story about you since before I arrived, he said. I've heard the whole thing by now. Too much, too certain, too capable. Makes men feel small. He paused. The problem with that story isn't that it's a lie. You are certain. You are capable. You do take up space. He looked at her. The problem is the conclusion they draw from it. That those things are defects. That the right response to a woman like you is to wait for her to shrink or leave when she doesn't. Eleanor didn't move. The breeze came down from the ridge and moved through the dry grass at the road's edge and went. Nobody before me was strong enough to stand beside you, he said. I don't mean that as an insult to them. People are who they are. But I'm telling you, I'm not in this because I think you're going to become someone different. I'm in it because of who you already are. He paused. And I've been standing here for 2 months, and I haven't found anything that changes that. The last light was leaving the bluffs, the copper draining to gray, and the first stars were showing above the eastern horizon where the sky was already darkening. Eleanor looked at him. She had spent 28 years in this town being told what she was and what she wasn't. She had spent 2 years before that in her own head saying the same things in quieter language. She had built walls that were not walls exactly. She was not a person who built walls. She was a person who built systems, and the system had been stay manageable, stay necessary, don't require anything that couldn't be accommodated without disruption. The system had worked in the sense that she was still standing. The system had cost her things she was only now totaling. "I'm afraid," she said. She had not said that out loud to another person in, she couldn't remember how long. It was not something she did. She said accurate things and useful things and honest things, but she did not say the raw thing, the underneath thing, the thing that was true before any of the reasoning happened. "Of what specifically?" he asked, not dismissing it, not reassuring it away. Asking. "That I'll let you in and you'll find the actual thing underneath all the competence and you'll recalibrate," she said. "Not because you're dishonest, just because the reality is harder than the idea." He was quiet for a moment. "That's possible," he said. She looked at him. "I can't guarantee the future," he said. "I can't tell you in July what we'll both be in 3 years. Nobody can." He looked at her steadily. "What I can tell you is that I've seen you angry and precise and wrong about one thing and right about 6 others and tired at the end of a day and uncertain at the end of a conversation. I've seen you manage a store and manage a town and manage your own feelings about both with a discipline that most people don't have. I haven't found the edge of it yet, the thing that makes me want to recalibrate. And I've been looking, not because I expected to find it, but because I knew you'd need to know I'd looked." Eleanor stood very still. "I've been looking," he said again quietly, "and I don't find it." The stars were coming in more fully now, the way they did in Texas summer. Not gradually, but all at once, as if they'd been waiting for the last of the day to clear the field. She looked up at them for a moment, the way she did sometimes when she needed to look at something that didn't require anything from her. Then she looked at him. "I'm not going to be different," she said. "I need you to understand that specifically, not smaller, not softer. I can be kinder when I'm not careful and ruder when I'm tired and wrong about things in ways I won't always catch, but I'm not going to change the fundamental—" "Eleanor," he said. "I know. I need to say it. I know you do, so say it." She breathed. The night air was settling, slightly cooler, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly cedar from the tree line. "I'm not going to change the fundamental things," she said. "The store, the way I think, the way I take up space. Those aren't negotiable." "Good," he said. The word was simple. It didn't try to be more than it was. "Good," she said, and felt something shift. Not break, not collapse, but shift. The way a door shifts when someone turns a handle and it moves in its frame without yet swinging open. They stood for another moment in the cooling dark. The stars settled in now and the road pale under them. And then they walked back toward town in the same easy silence they'd come out in. And Eleanor did not try to categorize what the walk back was compared to the walk out. They were different walks. The difference mattered. The proposal, when it came, was not what Dry Creek would have imagined. There was no public declaration, no orchestrated moment in front of witnesses. Rhett Mercer was not a man who performed things, and Eleanor Hartwell was not a woman who wanted to be performed at. It happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, in the store. He had come in for the regular account business, which they'd handled, and he'd stayed at the counter after the transaction was finished in the way he sometimes did when there was something else. He took something from his vest pocket, set it on the counter. It was a ring. Plain, gold, with a small and honest stone. Not extravagant, not designed to make a point about resources, designed to last. Eleanor looked at it. "I thought about waiting longer," he said, "for a better moment, or the right setting, or some configuration that would seem more—" He paused. "But that's not us. Waiting for the right moment when there's nothing actually to wait for." She looked at the ring on the counter. Her counter, in her store, in the town she'd been born in and stayed in and run a business in for 5 years that she had built into something good. "You should know," she said, "that this town is going to have a great deal to say about this." "I'm aware," he said. "They've had a lot to say about everything so far, and I've found I don't require their input." She almost smiled. "I'm serious, Rhett. It'll be worse once we're married. They'll watch every difficulty, every disagreement, every hard week. They'll be waiting for the ending they've already written." "Let them wait," he said. "They'll be waiting a long time. Eleanor looked at the ring for another moment. Then she looked at him. She thought about being 22 and making herself smaller so a man would stay. She thought about being 25 and watching someone be kind without being honest. She thought about every morning she'd opened this store alone, and every evening she'd walked home to the yellow kitchen, and every night she'd sat at the table with the wind under the door and the half-formed question she'd never let herself finish. She thought about a man who had looked for the edge of her and hadn't found it, who had said good when she told him she wasn't going to change. She picked up the ring. It fit. This surprised her. It's not the fit itself, but that she was surprised by it, by the fact of something fitting when she had spent so long operating on the assumption that nothing quite would. Yes, she said, not breathlessly, not tearfully. The way she said things, directly, with the full meaning of the word applied to the full meaning of the question. Yes, an unqualified, clear-eyed, both feet yes. Rhett let out a breath that she realized he'd been holding. It was the most human thing she'd seen him do, that exhale. The small evidence that he'd been uncertain, that he'd stood there wanting this enough to be afraid of the other answer. She had not thought about him being afraid. She had been so occupied with her own fear that she had not sufficiently accounted for his. You were nervous, she said. Reasonably, he said. You didn't show it. I was working on it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. We're going to fight sometimes, she said. You know that. I expect so. And I'm going to be right more often than I'm wrong. The corner of his mouth moved. We'll keep track, he said. I'll keep track, she said. I'm better with numbers. He laughed then, an actual laugh, short and real, and she thought that she would like to keep hearing that sound, would like it to be a regular feature of the architecture of her life, something she could count on, the way she counted on the weight of the ledger and the smell of the store in the morning and the mockingbird in the cedar tree. Tuesday's not usually this interesting, she said. No, he said, it's not. She put the ring on her finger where it stayed, and they stood on either side of the counter in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had arrived somewhere and were taking a moment to register it before moving on to whatever came next. Outside on Main Street, Dry Creek went about its Tuesday business, unknowing, certain of things it had been certain of for a long time. By Wednesday, it would know. By Thursday, the whole town would know, which meant the whole territory would know by the following week, and the story would go out in all directions like water finding its level, and people would say things, and Eleanor Hartwell standing in her store with a ring on her finger, and a man across the counter who had looked for the edge of her and not found it, did not care. Or more precisely, she was aware of it, and it was not large enough anymore to carry the weight it had carried before. Something had shifted in the proportion. The town's opinion had not gotten smaller. Eleanor had simply gotten more fully herself, and the self she was had less room in it now for the space the town's verdict had previously occupied. She had a distributor letter to write. She had a store to run. She had a Tuesday morning to get back to. The fence posts count for next month, she said, pulling the ledger toward her. You want the same volume as the last order? Rhett settled against the counter. Add 20%, he said. We're extending the East Pasture line. She wrote it down. The morning light held where it fell, and the pen moved, and outside the window Dry Creek continued being what it was, and not knowing yet what was coming. Not a scandal, not a disaster, not the ending it had been predicting for years, but something it was considerably less prepared for. Proof that it had been wrong. The news moved through Dry Creek the way Rhett had predicted, and Eleanor had known it would. Fast, thorough, and carrying the particular charge of something that didn't fit the story people had already written. By Wednesday morning, 3 separate people had found reasons to come into Hartwell Supply that had nothing to do with purchasing anything. Eleanor served them all with complete professionalism, answered no questions that weren't asked directly, and volunteered nothing. The ring was on her finger. It was visible. She did not hide it, and she did not display it. It was simply there. The way everything about Eleanor Hartwell was simply there, present, unambiguous, not requiring anyone's commentary to exist. Norma Wells came on Wednesday afternoon. Eleanor had expected her and had prepared herself in the specific way of someone who knows weather is coming and has decided to stand in it rather than find shelter. Norma came in, looked at Eleanor's hand, looked at Eleanor's face, and then did something Eleanor had not anticipated. She sat down on the low bench near the front window that Eleanor kept there for elderly customers who needed to wait, and she was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," Norma said finally. "A real one, not the one I started to give you in April." Eleanor looked at her. "All right." "I went to him," Norma said, "to Mercer, and I told him things about you that I had no business saying. Things I believed because I'd believed them so long I'd stopped examining whether they were true." She folded her hands in her lap. "And then I watched him for 3 months and found that nothing I'd said to him made a difference because the thing I'd described to him wasn't what he was seeing, and I had to ask myself—" She stopped. "I had to ask myself whether the problem was him or whether the problem was the description." Eleanor was quiet. "It was the description," Norma said. "I know that now. I don't know that I fully know why I had it, except that it was easy and it was old and nobody had ever asked me to put it down." She looked up at Eleanor with the directness of someone who had decided to be accurate rather than comfortable. "You deserved better from this town than you got. From me specifically. I'm sorry for it." Eleanor stood at the counter and looked at Norma Wells, 61 years old, silver-haired, someone she'd known her entire life, who had spent decades managing other people's narratives, with the cheerful certainty of someone who believed they were providing a service. She was not required to forgive this. She knew that. There was no rule that said an apology earned immediate absolution, and she was not a person who performed emotions she didn't feel. But she also recognized something in Norma's face that she had not expected to see there: genuine reckoning. The particular expression of someone who had looked at something they'd carried for years and found it lighter than they'd thought and heavier in the wrong ways. "I appreciate you saying it directly," Eleanor said. "That's not nothing." Norma nodded. She stood up, straightened her skirt. "I'll need 2 pounds of coffee," she said. "The good kind." "I know which kind you take," Eleanor said, and turned to get it. It was not a clean ending to 20 years of accumulated friction. Apologies didn't work that way. Not real ones. Not ones that had weight behind them. But it was something. The beginning of a different kind of accounting, maybe. Eleanor had been doing accounts her whole life. She understood that some columns took a long time to balance. Agnes Pell did not apologize. Eleanor had not expected her to, and was not disappointed. Agnes came into the store exactly once in the 2 weeks following the engagement, bought a quantity of spice tins, and departed with a dignity that Eleanor recognized as the particular dignity of someone who had decided to revise their position privately without announcing the revision. This was, in its way, as much as Eleanor would ever get from Agnes Pell, and she found she could accept it. Frank Decker said something to someone who passed it along, in the inevitable way of such things. And the something was, "Well, Mercer knows what he's getting into better than I would." It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was an acknowledgement that there was something to know, that Eleanor was a knowable quantity rather than an inexplicable one, and from Frank Decker, that was more than she'd anticipated. Doc Giles shook her hand in the street on a Thursday morning and said, with the economy of a man who didn't believe in decorating his meanings, "Good, it's good," and then walked on, which she thought was exactly right. Caleb, when she told him, put down the crate he was carrying very carefully and then stood with it for a moment with the expression of someone organizing a large feeling into a manageable size. Then he said, "Will you need me more hours once the operations combine?" She looked at him. "Why would the operations combine?" "The ranch account will be, if you're—" He stopped. "I don't actually know how that works." "Neither do I yet," she said. "We're figuring it out." He nodded. Then, with the sideways approach she had come to recognize, "I'm glad," he said. "That's all." "I know," she said. "So am I." He picked up the crate and carried it to the back. Eleanor watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that Caleb Moss was going to be a remarkable person when he finished growing into himself, and that she intended to have something to do with that. The wedding was in September, 3 weeks before the Whitmore acquisition closed. The timing was not calculated. It was simply when the arrangements came together, when the circuit preacher was available, when the season made practical sense. Eleanor was not a woman who spent significant energy on ceremony for its own sake. She wanted a wedding that was honest and specific and not a performance. Rhett, when she told him this, said that suited him exactly, which was one of the first of many moments in the planning process when they agreed without having to work at it, which was its own kind of relief. The ceremony was held at the town hall, not because the town hall was beautiful. It wasn't. It was a practical wood frame building with adequate lighting and insufficient ventilation, but because it held enough people and it belonged to the community, and Eleanor had lived in this community her whole life and was not going to pretend otherwise. She wore a dress she'd had made in town, gray-blue, plain, and good, the kind of dress that would be useful after the ceremony as well as during it. She carried nothing. She stood straight, the way she always stood. Rhett wore his good coat and his working boots because he'd told her he didn't own anything more formal, and she'd told him that was fine, and she'd meant it. The town came. That was the thing Eleanor had not entirely expected. Not the handful of close acquaintances she'd anticipated, but most of Dry Creek. The hall was full by the time the ceremony started. She looked out at the rows of faces. Norma Wells in the third row, Doc Giles beside Martha, who had the grace to look genuinely pleased, Caleb in the back standing very straight, a dozen ranch families she knew by name and account number, people she'd sold lamp oil and flour and rope to for 5 years. And she understood that she was looking at a community that had gotten a great deal wrong about her and had shown up anyway, which was imperfect and human, and she thought probably the best that communities managed to do. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried in public as a general matter, and she was not going to start at her own wedding, but she felt something when she looked out at those rows of faces that she did not have a word for and was not going to try to find one for, something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite belonging and not quite victory, but was a combination of all three in proportions that didn't resolve into any single category. Rhett was waiting at the front of the hall. He looked at her with an expression that was not performance. It was just him, watching her walk toward him with the attention he paid to things that mattered to him, which she had learned was the most concentrated form of respect he knew how to offer. She walked to him. They stood beside each other, which felt right. Not him in front of her, not her behind him, but beside, which was the arrangement they'd been working toward without naming it since a Tuesday morning when a stranger had come into her store and shaken her hand without thinking about it. The ceremony was short. The words were plain. When it was done, they were married, which was a simple fact on top of which the world had piled a great deal of complication over the years, but which was, at its center, simple. He kissed her once, briefly, without spectacle. She kissed him back. The hall made noise. The Whitmore situation resolved in November, 3 weeks after the acquisition closed. Eleanor had spent the intervening months running the alternative distributor negotiations with the same precision she applied to everything. The Dallas operation had been interested from the first letter. She had the volume and the payment history to make her attractive, which was the position she'd worked to establish before the situation became urgent. The Austin distributor she'd also approached had come in with a counter that was slightly better on delivery times but worse on margins. She'd played them against each other for 4 weeks, which was neither ruthless nor unusual. It was simply how negotiations worked when you knew what your operation needed and were not willing to accept less because someone else was in a hurry. She signed with Dallas in October. Better terms than she'd had with Whitmore's. Shorter delivery cycle. A first-year contract with a renewal clause she'd negotiated to her advantage. Red had read the contract before she signed it, because she'd asked him to, because a second pair of careful eyes on a significant contract was practical rather than sentimental. He'd found one clause she'd already flagged and agreed with her analysis of it. They discussed it for 20 minutes and arrived at the same conclusion through different reasoning, which she found more satisfying than arriving at it the same way. She signed on a Wednesday afternoon with Caleb as witness and sent the signed copies back on the Thursday mail wagon, and then sat at her counter and looked at the store, the shelves she'd organized, the accounts she kept, the space she'd built into something her father would have recognized, but that was also, in every meaningful way, entirely hers, and felt a satisfaction that was uncomplicated and real and didn't require anything from anyone else to be complete. The store was hers. The marriage was real. The distributor situation was resolved. These were facts. They sat cleanly alongside each other, 3 columns in a ledger that balanced. She had not become someone else to get here. That was the thing she kept returning to, in the quiet intervals between other thoughts. She had not softened herself or made herself smaller or performed a version of Eleanor Hartwell that fit more neatly into what Dry Creek thought it wanted. She had stayed exactly who she was and built exactly what she'd meant to build. And somewhere in the process, the world around her had not changed exactly, but shifted, adjusted, found that it could accommodate what it had previously declared unaccommodatable, or most of it had. Agnes Pell still walked past the store with a particular quality of dignity. Bill Kramer still squinted. There were still people in Dry Creek who had decided what they thought about Eleanor Hartwell and were not going to let a marriage and a successful distributor negotiation revise it. This was fine. This was how people were. You did not get to rewrite everyone, and trying to was an ambition Eleanor had never had. You got to live your life with enough honesty that the people paying attention could see it clearly, and the rest of them were going to see what they were determined to see regardless. She had made her peace with this. Not a dramatic peace, not a peace arrived at through some moment of clarity, just the gradual accumulation of evidence that other people's conclusions about her were simply not as relevant to the actual shape of her life as she'd once, in the long, quiet evenings and the unshared meals, allowed herself to fear they were. Boom. By the following spring, the Ropers Creek operation had expanded its eastern pasture, and the supply contract had grown accordingly. Eleanor had hired a second person, a woman named Ruth Daly, who was 22 and quick and had been doing accounts for her father's farm and wanted something more, to handle the counter on the days when the volume required it. Ruth was not Caleb, but she was her own kind of capable, and Eleanor trained her the way she'd trained everything she'd built, precisely, without shortcuts, with the expectation that the person being trained was smart enough to meet the standard. Caleb, at 16 now, had started handling the morning stock on his own before Eleanor arrived. He never said he was doing it. He just did it, and the shelves were faced, and the overnight count was done, and the coffee was on, and Eleanor came in each morning to a store that had already started its day without her. She paid him more. He did not say anything about the increase, neither did she. It was simply the correct accounting. She and Rhett had settled into the texture of a shared life, with the same lack of ceremony that characterized everything else between them. It was not always easy. There were weeks when the ranch demands and the store demands created a friction that neither of them could simply smooth over by goodwill alone. There were evenings when he was tired in the particular way of a man who had been managing other people's problems all day and needed quiet, and she was wound up in the particular way of a woman who had been doing the same. And the two states didn't always find their way to compatible quickly. There were arguments about money, specifically about a proposed investment in additional ranch equipment that Eleanor thought was premature given the current operating cash. This one went 3 evenings before they found a position they both thought was sound. She was right about the timing. He was right about the equipment being necessary eventually. The resolution was a delayed purchase with a specific cash threshold trigger that satisfied the logic of both positions. She had written it out on a piece of paper to make it concrete. He had signed it with the practical acceptance of a man who had learned that Eleanor's need to put agreements on paper was not distrust, but architecture. There were good weeks, too, the kind that didn't announce themselves as significant, but accumulated into the weight of a life that had genuine substance. Sunday mornings when the store was closed and she read at the table while he worked through the week's ranch correspondence across from her, both of them in the same room, not requiring conversation to be in each other's company. The spring evening when the fence line project was finally complete, and he came home with the kind of tired that was satisfaction rather than depletion, and she had made a supper that was better than her usual because she'd had time, and they'd eaten it without talking much, and the quiet had been full rather than empty. She had not known the difference between those two kinds of quiet until she had both of them to compare. In June of the following year, a year and 3 months after Rhett Mercer had walked into Hartwell Supply looking for lamp oil and double-braided rope, Eleanor was at the county seat for a distributor meeting when she ran into a woman she didn't know who knew who she was. The woman was from one of the smaller settlements to the east, one of the ones Eleanor had thought about when Rhett first mentioned the gap in the supply coverage, and she had apparently been following the situation in Dry Creek in the way that smaller settlements followed the affairs of the nearest significant town. "You're Eleanor Mercer," the woman said, "from the supply store." "Hartwell Mercer," Eleanor said. She had hyphenated because the store had always been Hartwell's, and she was not going to change that, and Rhett had said obviously when she'd told him, which was exactly the response she'd wanted. "I heard about the Dallas contract," the woman said, "and the expansion." Eleanor had opened a supply point in the smaller settlement. Not a full store, a supply point, a scheduled delivery operation with a small inventory buffer, staffed by a local person she'd trained. It had been running for 2 months. It's changed things out here. The distance to town was... She shook her head. It was a problem we'd lived with so long we'd stopped thinking of it as solvable. Eleanor looked at her. It was solvable, she said. It just needed someone to solve it. The woman laughed, a short, genuine sound. Well, she said, we're glad someone did. Eleanor thought about this on the ride back to Dry Creek. Thought about the version of herself who had sat in this same territory a year and a half ago and told herself that the expansion cost too much, not just in capital, but in the social friction of being a woman who did more than Dry Creek had decided she should. Thought about the calculation she'd been running for years that included, in its margins, the weight of other people's certainty about her limits. The calculation had been wrong. Not because the social friction wasn't real. It had been. It continued to be in diminished form. But because she had allowed that friction to function as a ceiling, had let the town's doubt become a factor in her own accounting in ways she hadn't always been honest about. What had changed was not the town. The town was largely the same. Norma Wells was still Norma Wells. Agnes Pell still walked past with her particular dignity. The gossip still moved the way gossip moved in small places, through cracks and walls, surfacing changed from where it went in. What had changed was that Eleanor had stopped including their doubt in her own figures, had drawn a clean line between what they thought was possible and what she had determined was possible, and had built from the second number rather than the first. This was not wisdom she could have told herself earlier and made stick. It had to be arrived at through the specific sequence of things that had happened, through a man who kept coming back, through an argument about lumber grades and a conversation on a road at dusk and a ring on a counter on a Tuesday morning. Through being seen specifically enough by one person that the general not seen of everyone else had finally lost its structural weight. She had needed someone to see her before she could fully see herself. She was honest enough to admit this, even as she was clear-eyed enough to understand that the seeing had always been available to her. It was the willingness to be seen that had been the harder thing. The willingness to let what was true about her be true without apology, without the constant management of other people's comfort with it. She was still working on this. Some days she managed it better than others. There were still mornings when she walked down Main Street and felt the weight of a town that had decided things, and still needed to consciously put that weight down and keep walking. The old habit did not disappear entirely. It just had less authority than it used to. On a Tuesday in late June, almost exactly 2 years after the first Tuesday, the one with the lamp oil and the rope and a stranger who hadn't done the thing men usually did when they first registered her height, Eleanor opened the store at 7 o'clock, put the coffee on, wiped down the front counter with the damp cloth she kept for the morning dust, and began going through the day's accounts. Ruth came in at 5:30 and took the floor. Caleb came in at 8 and went directly to the back without being directed, the morning stock already half done. At 9:15, Rhett came through the front door. He did this sometimes. Came in not for a transaction, but in the space between ranch business and whatever was next. The way people moved through places that were also home. She had come to understand this about the store, in the year since they'd married, that it was not just hers, that it had become, without negotiation, a place he moved through easily, that he had his own relationship to the shelves and the counter and the smell of lamp oil and sawdust and coffee. She looked up when he came in. "Nothing's on fire," he said, which was what he said when he came in without a specific reason, shorthand they'd developed for "I'm here because I wanted to be." "I know," she said. "I'd smell it." He came to the counter, looked at the accounts she was working on. "The Dallas margin holding. Better than projected," she said. "3rd month running." He nodded, picked up the coffee mug she kept on the counter, found it empty, and went to refill it from the pot, which was something he'd started doing without asking. She had noticed when he first did it and had not said anything, because there was nothing to say, because what it was a man who was at home in a place and moved through it accordingly. He set the refilled mug back on the counter near her hand. She picked it up, drank. Outside on Main Street, Dry Creek was going about a Tuesday in late June with the ordinary energy of a town that had largely made its adjustments and was now simply living with the results. People walked past the window. A wagon moved south toward the feed store. Two women she recognized from church stood on the corner talking with the particular posture of women who had found something worth discussing. None of it was looking at Eleanor. Not this morning, not with the particular focused quality it had carried 2 years ago. She had become, over the course of these 2 years, something the town had incorporated, not fully understood, not fully comfortable with, but incorporated. The woman who ran Hartwell Supply and had married the Ropers Creek foreman and had opened the supply point east of town and ran a tighter operation than anyone within 40 miles. The woman who had always been there and who would continue to be there and who had turned out, despite everything the town had said and believed for so long, to be exactly what she'd always claimed to be. Exactly enough. Not too much. Not a problem to be managed, or a warning to be issued, or a story about a woman who needed to be smaller to be loved. Just a person, specific and real, who had built a life that fit her rather than the other way around, and who had found, somewhere in the middle of it, a man who understood the difference. Rhett was reading through the week's correspondence now, standing at the far end of the counter, doing his own work in her space, which was their arrangement. Separate and alongside, the two things not in conflict. Eleanor looked at her ledger. The numbers were clean, the columns were balanced. The morning was ordinary and good in the specific way of mornings that had earned their ordinariness. Not the thin good of nothing going wrong, but the substantial good of things going right because you had built them carefully over time. She picked up her pen. The morning light came through the front window in its plain, unhurried way, and the store smelled the way it always smelled. And somewhere in the cedar tree at the back of the property, the mockingbird was running through its repertoire again, relentless and unself-conscious, singing with the full force of what it was without apparent concern for whether the audience found it too much. Eleanor wrote. The numbers moved, column by column, into their proper places, and the day began.